Why has Nebraska failed? We're just a few hours away from the final game of the 2022 Nebraska football season against Iowa. Some videos you make, like the reaction videos, those are kind of a one-time thing. People watch them. They probably don't watch them again. This one is an attempt by me to put a stake in the ground so that 5 years from now we can come back to this moment and realize where we were, who we were, and what we were doing. And in order to start with why has Nebraska failed, we're going to start with Frank Solich. I'm John Johnston, Corn Nation. Please like this video so more people will see it, and subscribe to my channel. Frank Solich. We all know this story. If you know the story of Nebraska football, Tom Osborne, legendary coach Tom Osborne, 25 years, always won 9 games a season, never lost more than 3. Pretty phenomenal record, national titles, conference championships, and then along comes Frank Solich. And there's a lot of people, particularly old people like me, because I'm eligible for AARP now. We romanticize the past, and there's this feeling that, well, Frank should have never been fired. And that's kind of a lie. And that's what we do when we get older. We lie about the past because the further we get away from it, the more we romanticize it. All the big plays we made were even bigger, and the bad times we had weren't nearly that bad. Frank finished at Nebraska 58-19 overall, 33-15 in conference. Big 12 championship in 1999, Big 12 North championships 1999 through 2001. And the reason why I say it's kind of a lie that, there's these people that believe Frank Solich should have never been fired. Frank went 7-7 in 2002, and I remember that. I remember people just freaked out because of the whole 9-win season thing, and suddenly we were 7-7, we were 500. Oh my God, Frank is destroying the program. And there were tons of people with that attitude toward Frank Solich. So in 2003, Frank gets fired by Steve Pederson after a 9-3 season. Now, the 3 losses were 41-24 to Missouri, 31-7 to Kansas, or to Texas, 38-9 to Kansas State. They were kind of important games, and they were fairly big blowouts. My position on Frank is Frank was going to be fired anyway because he was following a legendary coach. And when you follow a legendary coach, or a legendary anything, you better be legendary yourself. And Frank was not legendary. Frank was a good coach. He went to Ohio, and he kind of became a savior there, a big name, and did a good job. I know that before Frank arrived at Ohio, people would go to the games to see the band, and they'd leave to halftime. And I know that because a good friend of mine from college at Nebraska is a professor at Ohio. But Frank was a good coach at Ohio. The problem is, firing him after a 9-3 season, Steve Pederson should have allowed him to fail. If he really thought that he was letting the program descend into mediocrity, as he stated, he should have allowed him to fail. Because you fired a guy at 9-3, and you set the stage for everybody having to meet that standard. I think the coaches out there looking at that and going, okay, if I'm even that good, I'm still might face the possibility of getting fired. So Steve Pederson is a name that we don't say around Nebraska. He's probably still one of the most hated men in Nebraska because he was an egomaniac dipshit for doing that. And the other problem was Steve Pederson obviously didn't have a follow-up plan to that, or people told him no because they didn't want to be fired after a 9-3 season. So after a 40-day coaching search, Pederson settles on one Bill Callahan, who had just been let go by the Raiders. He had Houston Nutt, apparently. There's the old joke about Houston Nutt getting ready to get on a plane and come to be the coach in Nebraska. Well, that didn't work out. So 2004, Bill Callahan's the new coach. I remember the spring game that everybody was thinking that the option was outdated and Frank's offense was outdated. And in our first spring game, we came out in the West Coast offense and did all the shifting, and everybody cheered. Oh, how little did we know. Anyway, his first season, Bill Callahan went 2004, he went 5-6, and it was Nebraska's first losing season in 40 years. And Bill Callahan finished with a 27-22 record. He was 0-17 in games he trailed at the half, and he had 2 losing seasons out of the 4. Now, there are a lot of people that look at Bill Callahan's tenure and say, well, if he would have gotten rid of Kevin Cosgrove, he would have been okay. Kevin Cosgrove was his defensive coordinator, and Kevin Cosgrove had no clue as to how to defend against the spread offense, which was the thing. Zone reads, inverted veers all over the place. Cosgrove just didn't know how to do that. He was an old Big Ten guy that knew how to defend against 3 yards in a cloud of dust. Bill Callahan would have failed at Nebraska regardless. And the reason why Bill Callahan would have failed is because he wasn't a leader. Every time that anything got bad or he was asked any question that was difficult, he did the equivalent of hiding under his desk. In fact, toward the end of his career, or toward the end of his reign at Nebraska, he was asked how he thought he did, and he replied he thought he did an excellent job in every area, which it has to be dumber than the fucking hillbillies comment he made about Oklahoma. But Bill Callahan, since his career at Nebraska ended, went on to be, and he's known as one of the best position coaches, as offensive line coaches in the NFL. And he has never aspired to be a head coach again. Harvey Perlman fires Steve Pederson, appoints Tom Osborne as the interim AD, and everybody thinks, okay, Tom's back to save the program. Osborne hires Bo Pelini after a 9-day search. You remember the 40-day search. Now it's a 9-day search. And the thing about that search, well, we'll leave that to later. Okay, Bo Pelini. Bo Pelini finished with a 67-27 record overall, 39-17 in conference. He won the 2009 Big 12 championship game. Remember that? 1 second back on the clock. Mac Brown, his finger up, and the Big 12 kowtowing to Texas. He won the Big 12 North from 2008 to 2010 and the Big 10 Legends Conference in 2012. Remember the Legends and Leaders? That was good. 2014, Bo gets fired by Shawn Eichorst, new athletic director, to replace interim AD Tom Osborne. After another coach fired after a 9-3 season, and again, if Shawn Eichorst thought that Bo Pelini was going to fail, he should have let him fail. So 2 times Nebraska athletic directors have fired coaches after 9-3 season. And what that's done is it's coaches out there look at that and they go, okay, if I ever have a bad season, I'm going to be fired. And it severely limits the pool of people that are going to probably look at your program because they kind of look at it and they go, maybe that Pederson guy was an egomaniac and maybe Shawn Eichorst was an idiot, but still that's the standard they set. And if I have one bad season, whether it's due to a recruiting class that doesn't work out, injuries, locusts, I could be fired. Why would I go coach there? And you have to think that that's in the back of the minds of some people who would consider this job. One thing I want to bring about Bo Pelini. If you remember the end of his coaching career at Nebraska, there were 2 audio tapes that were released. The first one was bitching about the fans being fair weather fans, which is kind of weird because, the sellout streak and the fans always show up. But he bitched about the fans, and that was a big knock on the fans. And it really kind of made a lot of people just upset with Bo Pelini. And the second audio tape that was released came out after Bo Pelini was fired. And Bo Pelini called Shawn Eichorst the C word that I'm not even going to say, even though I use the F word all the time. That's what I think of that word. And it was terrible. Remember the fact that both those audio tapes were released, because we're going to get to even more stuff later. I think a lot of people had a lot of respect for Bo Pelini, and he won a lot of games. My biggest problem with Bo Pelini is that he wouldn't change. We would get blown out by the better teams, and we did get blown out by better teams. Melvin Gordon's 409 yards. I'm sure Bo Pelini is sick of hearing about that. But he would be asked about his defense, and he would say, my defense is fine. I don't need to change. And he did. Something needed to change because he kept doing the same thing over and over and losing big games. And that's probably, we could argue for a long time about, did Bo Pelini get fired because of his behavior, or did he get fired because he was losing big games? Bo Pelini left Nebraska, became the head coach at Youngstown State. After that, he went to LSU, and he was fired by them after one season on December 21st, 2020. And at this point in time, Bo Pelini is no longer in coaching. If I had his millions and I could take a break and not have to deal with all of us as fans, I probably would do the same thing. Mike Riley, hired by Shawn Eichorst. And you kind of look at that in hindsight and you go, why was this on anybody's radar? You know, I remember we all had to look up Mike Riley when he was hired, because nobody knew who he was. He was a coach at Oregon State, and he finished with a 19-19 career record at Nebraska, 12-14 in the Big Ten, 4-8 in 2017, the worst record since 1961. So we keep sinking deeper into these things. But Mike Riley, hired by Shawn Eichorst, he was a complete opposite of Bo Pelini. He was a really nice guy. He even attended his own press conference of him being fired. He hugged reporters when he left. But Shawn Eichorst at the time, there's a lot of people that say, well, Shawn Eichorst was trying to hire the anti-Bo Pelini and make up for PR. And my take on this is I think Shawn Eichorst was more concerned about NCAA compliance and lawsuits than he was winning. And I think that really led to Shawn Eichorst's downfall, because Shawn Eichorst is the next guy that's fired. In 2017, Shawn Eichorst is fired by Ronnie Green. A guy named Bill Moos is hired. Bill Moos lasts until 2021. Bill Moos comes in, and Mike Riley goes away, and Scott Frost, the savior boy, the guy who brought us the 1997 national championship as a quarterback, the native son, the second coming of Tom Osborne, is hired. Without only one winning season in his head coaching career, when he went 13-0 at 2017 UCF, University of Central Florida. And we were so excited when he was hired. And I can remember being at a spring game and talking to one of his former linemen, the guy saying, you know, if Scott can't figure this out, I don't know who can. And Scott Frost's career, he ended up being the worst Nebraska coach in school history. 16-31 overall career record, no bowl games, no signature wins, 0-14 record against ranked opponents, 5-20 or 5-22 in one-score games. You know, I could keep going with these things for a while, because that guy set a lot of records for bad, for awful, terrible. You can't use, there's not enough adjectives. Over 4 years at Nebraska, Scott Frost, he never made a single bit of improvement to our program since he started from day one. Yet we gave him, Mike Riley lasted 3 years, and really nobody shed a tear when Mike Riley was fired. In fact, there were constant articles after Mike Riley was fired about how he destroyed the program. Scott Frost told us that Mike Riley destroyed the program, and it would take him time. So we gave him time, and everybody believed in him, and everybody wanted this to work. And in the end, what happened was, again, he became the worst coach in Nebraska school history. And the other problem with that is this. The stories and the rumors about Scott Frost after he was fired that came out, probably the most egregious, directly job-related, is that he allegedly was too drunk to meet with one of the top recruits in the nation, somebody that was a Husker legacy family. And I could go into more of the rumors about him not showing up for practice on time when he made statements to the public about this team doesn't do the little things and we need to do the little things. He didn't bother to shave. He didn't bother in public appearances to not have a chew in. Shows up at his last Big Ten media days. Can't button up his tie. Can't act like a person who's been a professional being paid $5 million a year. Do you get it that I'm disgusted with this guy? Because I am. And it's not just because he was the savior boy gone wrong. It was because he was allowed to do this. Now let's go back a minute. And let's look at what I mentioned before. You remember when Bo Pelini was fired? Our Nebraska media was more than happy to release those audio tapes. They were more than happy to take Bo Pelini and bury him into the ground. Part of that was Bo Pelini's doing with his temper, but part of that was the Nebraska media that he really didn't get along with because he was hard to deal with. Now, compare that to how Scott... In fact, go back. You can go back and look at Bo Pelini articles. And as a photographer, as a guy who's done sports photography, I can tell you, when you're at an event, you take thousands of photographs. You can have any picture of a coach you want. You can get him picking his nose. You can get him screaming at people, which is what, if you go back and look at like Omaha World Herald articles published with Bo Pelini, you can find damn near all of them, or if not all of them, are a Bo Pelini screaming at somebody. They could have taken a picture of Bo Pelini with another coach smiling and laughing, but those weren't the photos they chose to use. Now compare that to Scott Frost. Has there been any articles about Scott Frost's malfeasance? Has there been any articles, any public anything about Scott Frost at Nebraska? Any behind-the-scenes stuff, any behavioral stuff? There's been zero, and pretty much anything negative anybody has said has been scrubbed off the internet. We are now, right now, on November 25th, 2022, hours before the Iowa game. We are the worst Power 5 program in football. We haven't been to a bowl game for God knows how many years. Even Kansas is going to go to a bowl game this year. Our program didn't get to this point just because of Scott Frost. There were a whole shit ton of people that enabled that behavior, that never said anything about it. I'm not just talking about Nebraska's media. There is no doubt the boosters are involved in this, that they have influence, that administrators have influence, that Tom Osborne, a name I barely mentioned here, had influence in keeping Scott Frost around. For what? So they could have access to the program? So because they thought that sooner or later he would get his shit together and grow up and be a coach? But there are a lot of people that enabled that behavior and enabled this to happen. And when Trev Alberts fired Scott Frost, he said, this program is bigger than any one person. And it is. It's bigger, certainly bigger than, it is. It's bigger than all of us. Because a lot of people in Nebraska rely on this program to be good, to feed the ego of the state, good or bad. That's how it is. All right, Tom Osborne. I haven't mentioned Tom Osborne a lot, and people don't ever say anything negative about Tom Osborne because it's the equivalent of tearing up a picture of the Pope on Saturday Night Live. If you don't understand that reference, go look it up. But Tom Osborne, it has to be mentioned here if I'm going to be honest about this. First of all, go back to Frank Solich. Osborne dictated, he didn't just dictate that Frank was going to be the next head coach. He also dictated that Frank had to keep all of Tom's assistants. Now, you could look at that and say, well, Tom was loyal. Okay. Dr. Tom also has a degree in educational psychology. He had to know that when the leadership of a group changes, that the dynamics of the group change as well. Or was it loyalty that took place of that idea? Because really, if you were going to say Frank's the next head coach, and I think Frank had to be the next coach, we had to do that. It's kind of like a story arc of an adventure. It just, the new guy has to take over, and we have to see how he does. Otherwise, everybody would be angry about, why'd you go out and hire this outsider when we had this guy in waiting? And he's a Nebraska guy, and we have that issue with Nebraska guys still to this day. Frank finally got to fire his coaches, and he had one season with his new coaches, one of them who included Bo Pelini, and he went 9-3 with his new coaches. And personally, I would have liked to have seen what Frank could have done with his new coaching staff, but he never got the chance. So Tom Osborne comes in, remember that, interim AD, and he hires Bo Pelini. Did he conduct a national search? Or did he just look out there and say, well, there's only Turner Gill and Bo Pelini, and these are the two I'm selecting? Bo Pelini immediately became a Nebraska guy for some reason. You could look back and look at that and say, did we deserve to hire a new athletic director and let the new athletic director go on a national search. But there's that argument. If you're going to be honest about this, you have to put that in there. We blame Harvey Perlman for going to the Big Ten, which is an excellent move, the best move Nebraska ever did, because there is a university attached to the football team, and it is responsible for supplying the state of Nebraska with intelligent people. That's just slightly important. So moving to the Big Ten academically was a huge thing, and a good thing. You know, you still have your arguments from people, oh, we should have stayed in the Big 12. Anyway, we all blame Harvey Perlman for that. He destroyed the football program. He hired Shawn Eichorst, and he moved us to the Big Ten. Well, we do that because we don't want to blame Tom Osborne. You remember that whole tearing up a picture of the Pope thing? Nobody wants to blame Tom. He's a legend. And, you know, he was a legend. He was a legendary football coach, and he has been the mentor to God knows how many thousands and thousands of people, and he's done an excellent job, but he hasn't done everything good. And some of the ways in which he failed, you can't look at right now and say with an honest face that he wasn't influential in keeping Scott Frost around. And was that because of loyalty? Because that level of loyalty burned Frank Solich, probably. And did it do Scott Frost any favors? Nobody wants to see Scott Frost again. And that's kind of sad because he's not that old. He did a lot of this to himself, but I don't know if he got a lot of help from anybody else or if he just flat out refused it. Tom Osborne has had his hand in this stuff of us being right now on November 25th, 2022, the worst Power 5 program in football. And if you want to be honest with yourself, that's where we are. And we're on the cusp of, hey, maybe beating Iowa today and costing them the Big 10 West Championship. I wouldn't bet on it. But we're on the cusp of a new era. And we're right here ready to hire the next coach. So why has Nebraska failed? People like to take complex issues and reduce them down to one thing. And if I have to pick that one thing, well, here's what it's not. It's not because we don't have a fullback. It's not because we got away from option football. It's not because we got away from power football. It's not because we left the Big 12. It's not because we lost our recruiting base. Because we've out-recruited the Big 10 West, our main opponents, for like 10 years straight. Maybe a couple misses in there, but close enough. It's because we have constantly hired the wrong personnel. You start out with Frank Solich. Okay, Frank Solich he's the heir apparent, but he has to keep the previous coaches, doesn't get to pick his own staff. That's a fail. You promote Steve Pederson, and his ego takes over. That's a fail. He hires Bill Callahan because he failed in hiring other coaches before him and had to settle on a coach. That's a fail. You get Tom Osborne comes back in, doesn't do a national coaching search, hires Bo Pelini because he's familiar. That's a fail. Potentially, I mean, we could argue that one. Shawn Eichorst, recommended by Barry Alvarez, hired by Harvey Perlman with Tom Osborne's influence, a fail because he then turns around, fires Bo Pelini after a 9-3 season, hires Mike Riley, who was like doomed to fail. And then after that, we look at it, Bill Moos, guy who after his tenure is over is known for a bit of the bottle and for being an absentee leader, which you can't really be an absentee leader. That's an oxymoron. Hire Scott Frost, something we all thought was a surefire at the time. And every one of these things turned out to be bad personnel decisions. They really did. I think in some cases you couldn't help but make them, but certainly in other cases they were just terrible. And it's not, the key here is not that it isn't just the failed football coach that's the problem. It's failed athletic directors, administrators. And you could probably go above them. And if you want to blame Harvey Perlman, I guess fine. I don't think he's to blame for most of this stuff, but people like to blame him. Everything has to be aligned for success to happen. It has to be from the top. The chancellor, president, CEOs, vice presidents, head football coach, athletic directors. They all have to align in their goals. They all have to align in their vision. And if they don't, you get tension and you get dysfunction in an organization. And over the past 20 years, that describes Nebraska in a nutshell. Where do we go from here? You kind of have to trust that Trev Alberts knows what he's doing because you don't have a choice. And I think it's going to be exciting to see who we get for a new coach. What did we learn from all of this? I don't know. I think that time will tell us what we learned from all of this. Did we learn that we can't just look at Nebraska guys and think that somebody has to be attached to Nebraska and they have to understand Nebraska black shirt traditions and other traditions and they have to be one of us? God, I hope not. Because I think that's hurt us a lot. We're on the cusp of becoming Auburn of the Big Ten, and that's not a good thing. For us to move forward doesn't just require that Trev Alberts makes the right hire. It requires that all of those people that were involved in keeping Scott Frost around for their own selfish reasons stop being so selfish and put the program ahead of themselves. And that's a big requirement. And it's kind of a damning statement. But there's going to be a lot where we go from here, the things to get straight so that we can be successful. There's one more thing I'm going to mention, and then I'm going to go. Prepare for this game. There's one thing that's been consistent through this whole thing, and it's Nebraska fans. We have all stuck together in all kinds of weather. That's pretty admirable. We beat each other to death, kind of like we are a big, giant, dysfunctional family, but we're still here, and I hope we're still here going forward. Because we all love this thing, even though it's wretched and pathetic right now, and we have hope for it to get better in the future. I hope we're all still together. I hope we're decent to each other. I hope that we can take a few of the things that we used to separate us and just put them aside. Like this concept of who's the true fan and who isn't, or who's been a longer fan and who isn't. Just push it away. And just be nice to each other. Just let's go. We're all in this together in all kinds of weather for dear old Nebraska U. It's in the song. I think that's enough. John Johnston, leave me comments. I know you will. And push back if you feel the need to push back. That's certainly welcome. I welcome any kind of feedback. Go Big Red, beat Iowa, for God's sakes. It's the last hope. It'd be really nice to go into this offseason with just a piece of football team positivity.